The day I found 6 torn yard waste bags dumped along the curb in front of my house, something finally clicked in my head. It wasn't Ndapos, T an accident. It wasn't Ndapos, T bad timing. And it definitely wasn't Ndapos, T my imagination. The crazy part is, by that point, it had been happening for almost 4 months. I live in a quiet subdivision outside Cedar Ridge, Tennessee. Nothing fancy. The kind of neighborhood where people wave from their driveways, kids ride bikes until sunset, and everyone pretends to get along during the annual block barbecue. When my wife Emily and I moved there 3 years ago, we honestly thought we and Ndapos, D found the perfect place to settle down. For a while, it felt that way. Then there was Rick Holloway. Rick was president of the neighborhood association. Mid-60s. Retired insurance guy. Always wore polo shirts tucked into khakis like he was running for city council, even though nobody asked him to. He was one of those men who never raised his voice because he didn't Ndapos, T need to. Somehow he could make a simple sentence sound like an order. Most people tolerated him. Some people liked him. A few people were scared of him. At first, I was somewhere in the middle. Then the yard waste started showing up. The first time, I didn't Ndapos, T think much about it. A couple bags of grass clippings sat near my curb before trash collection day. I assumed a landscaping crew had dropped them in the wrong spot. The truck picked them up 2 days later. Problem solved. Or so I thought. 3 weeks later, there were more. Not just bags this time. Broken branches. Dead leaves. A pile of mulch. Enough stuff that delivery drivers had trouble pulling up close to the curb. Now, I work from home running a small specialty electronics business. Most of my inventory arrives through freight deliveries. Having access to the curb wasn't Ndapos, T some minor preference. It actually mattered. So one afternoon I walked over to Rick Ndapos' house. He was watering flowers when I arrived. End quote. Hey Rick, end quote, I said. End quote. Do you know anything about the yard waste showing up in front of my place? End quote. He didn't Ndapos, T even looked surprised. Instead, he chuckled. End quote. Oh that? End quote. That. Like we were discussing weather. End quote. Yeah, end quote, he said. End quote. The landscaping crews use that section sometimes before pickup day, end quote. I frowned. End quote. My section, end quote. He shrugged. End quote. Nobody uses it, end quote. I remember standing there staring at him for a second. Because technically, yes, the curb belonged to the city. But everyone in the neighborhood understood that the space in front of your property was your responsibility. Your grass. Your sidewalk. Your appearance. Your problem. Except apparently when it benefited Rick. I explained that I needed the area clear for deliveries. He smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind that says the conversation is already over. End quote. Relax, Mason. It Ndapos. LL all be gone by Friday, end quote. Then he turned back to his flowers. Just like that. The whole interaction lasted maybe 3 minutes. But I walked home feeling strangely irritated. Not because of the yard waste. Because of how casually he and Ndapos, D dismissed me. Like my concerns were an inconvenience. Like he and Ndapos, D already decided his needs mattered more than mine. A month later, it happened again. Then again. And again. Each time there was more debris. Each time it appeared right before collection day. And each time it somehow ended up directly in front of my property. Not Rick Ndapos' S. Not the common area. Not the empty lot near the entrance. Mine. Around that time, Emily started noticing how annoyed I was getting. One evening she found me standing at the front window looking at 3 giant bags of leaves sitting by the curb. She laughed. End quote. You know you and Ndapos. Staring at garbage, right? End quote. End quote. I know, end quote. End quote. You and Ndapos. V been staring at it for 10 minutes, end quote. I sighed. End quote. It and Ndapos. S not the leaves, end quote. End quote. Then what is it? End quote. I didn't Ndapos, T answer immediately. Because honestly, I was still trying to figure that out myself. The truth was, the bags weren't Ndapos, T the real issue anymore. What bothered me was the message. Every pile dumped there felt like someone saying, we can do whatever we want, and you can't Ndapos, T stop us. And for some reason, that thought kept bothering me more than it probably should have. What I didn't Ndapos, T know then was that things were about to get much worse. Because 2 weeks later, I overheard a conversation at a neighborhood cookout that changed everything I thought I knew about why Rick kept choosing my house. And once I learned the real reason, The whole situation stopped feeling like carelessness. It started feeling personal. It happened during the annual summer cookout the neighborhood association hosted every July. The event was always the same. Folding tables, cheap burgers, kids running through sprinklers. Somebody and Oppo's uncle arguing about football before preseason had even started. Emily was talking with a group of neighbors while I stood near the grill grabbing another drink when I overheard two landscaping contractors talking behind me. At first I wasn't Oppo's paying attention. Then one of them mentioned my address. That got my attention real fast. End quote. Rick always uses the Carter place. End quote. One guy said. The other laughed. End quote. Yeah, because he still hasn't Oppo's gotten over that meeting. End quote. They both chuckled. Then they walked away before I could hear anything else. That sentence sat in my head all evening. He still hasn't Oppo's gotten over that meeting. What meeting? The answer came later that night. Around 10:00 and Oppo's clock, after most people had gone home, my neighbor Carl wandered over carrying a beer. Carl had lived there longer than anyone. The man knew everything. Not because he was nosy, because people naturally told him things. After a few minutes of conversation, I casually asked him about Rick. Carl gave me a look. Then he laughed. End quote. Oh, you and Oppo's finally figuring it out. End quote. End quote. Figuring what out? End quote. Carl took a sip. End quote. You really Don and Oppo's remember the budget meeting last year? End quote. Then it hit me. The budget meeting. About 18 months earlier, the HOA board had proposed spending nearly $40,000 on decorative stone entrance signs. I had attended the meeting because the special assessment would have increased homeowner fees. During the discussion, I questioned several numbers in the proposal. Nothing dramatic. Nothing personal. Just questions. Questions Rick couldn't and Oppo's answer. In front of nearly 50 homeowners. The proposal ended up getting delayed and later reduced significantly. At the time I thought it was over. Apparently Rick didn't and Oppo's Carl shook his head. End quote. That man holds grudges like they and Oppo's family heirlooms. End quote. I laughed. At first. Then I stopped laughing. Because suddenly every strange interaction over the past year started making sense. The dismissive attitude. The little comments. The way he always seemed irritated whenever I spoke during meetings. I wasn't Oppo's imagining it. Rick remembered. And maybe the yard waste wasn't Oppo's about convenience at all. Maybe it was about reminding me who controlled the neighborhood. When I got home, I told Emily what Carl had said. She listened quietly. Then she asked one simple question. End quote. Can you prove any of it? End quote. I hated that question. Because the answer was no. I couldn't and Oppo's prove motive. I couldn't and Oppo's prove retaliation. All I could prove was that yard waste kept appearing in front of my house. And that and Oppo's when my approach changed. Up until then, I and Oppo's been treating it like a disagreement. Now I started treating it like evidence. Every time debris appeared, I documented it. Photos, video, date, time, weather conditions, descriptions. I created a folder on my computer, then another folder, then a spreadsheet. Emily joked that I was building a criminal case against lawn clippings. Maybe I was. But the more information I collected, the more obvious the pattern became. 8 separate incidents. For months. Every single one connected to landscaping work authorized through the HOA. Every single one ending up at my curb. Not once did the staging area rotate. Not once did it move. Not once did anyone ask permission. One Saturday afternoon, I decided to go a step further. I downloaded the HOA governing documents. Now, I know reading HOA rules sounds about as exciting as reading tax instructions. But if you and Oppo's ever dealt with someone who loves rules, you and Oppo's learned something important. The people who hide behind rules usually leave a paper trail. 3 hours later, I found exactly what I was looking for. Section 4. Paragraph 3. Clear as day. No organic debris, landscaping materials, or maintenance waste may be temporarily staged within a resident and Oppo's designated frontage area without written consent from that homeowner. I actually laughed out loud. Because you know who had personally overseen the revision of those rules 2 years earlier? Rick. His name was literally on the amendment documents. The man had written the rule himself. That night, I prepared a formal letter. No emotion. No insults. No threats. Just facts. I cited the section. attached photographs, listed dates, requested that the activity stop within 7 days. Then I sent copies through certified mail and email. Everything documented, everything professional. When the delivery confirmation arrived, I figured one of two things would happen. Either Rick would stop, or he and Apos, D respond. What I didn't and Apos, T expect was complete silence. No email, no phone call, no conversation, nothing, for an entire week. Then came Tuesday morning. I opened my front door and immediately started laughing. Not because anything was funny, because I couldn't and Apos, T believe what I was looking at. 2 enormous bags of fresh grass clippings sat directly in front of my mailbox. Bright green, freshly cut, almost like they had been delivered overnight. I stood there staring at them. Then I looked across the street, then down the block, then back at the bags, and something inside me finally settled. You ever reach a point where you and Apos are no longer angry? Where frustration burns itself out and leaves behind absolute clarity? That and Apos, that's where I was. I wasn't and Apos, T furious. I wasn't and Apos, T emotional. I was done. That evening, Emily found me sitting at the kitchen table. I had a notebook open, a calculator, and a rental website on my laptop. She looked over my shoulder. End quote. What are you doing? End quote. I looked up. Planning. She raised an eyebrow. End quote. Mason. End quote. End quote. It and Apos, S legal. End quote. The fact that those were the first words out of my mouth made her laugh. End quote. Mason. End quote. End quote. It and Apos, S completely legal. End quote. She sat down across from me, that smile slowly spreading across her face. The one she gets when she already knows exactly what I and Apos am thinking. End quote. What are you planning? End quote. I leaned back. Then I explained everything. Every detail. Every step. Every precaution. By the time I finished, she was trying not to laugh. End quote. I can't and Apos, T believe you and Apos, actually doing this. End quote. End quote. Oh, I and Apos am doing it. End quote. The next morning, I picked up a utility trailer from a rental company on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just a flatbed with enough room for everything. And by everything, I mean everything. Every bag, every branch, every pile of mulch, every scrap of debris that had accumulated over the previous week. I loaded it all carefully, methodically, almost respectfully, because this wasn't and Apos, T vandalism. It wasn't and Apos, T destruction. It wasn't and Apos, T revenge in the traditional sense. I was simply returning property to the person who seemed most interested in storing it. By sunset, the trailer was full, and as I secured the final strap, I looked down the street toward Rick and Apos' house. For the first time in months, I felt completely calm. Because the argument was over. The reminders were over. The warnings were over. And the next move wasn't and Apos, T going to involve another conversation. It was going to involve a very full trailer and a lesson Rick was never going to forget. The sun was already dropping behind the trees when I pulled the trailer out of my driveway. I remember thinking how ridiculous the whole situation was. I and Apos am a grown man, 42 years old, driving through my own neighborhood with a trailer full of leaves and grass clippings like I was transporting some kind of agricultural treasure. But the more I thought about it, the funnier it became. Because none of this should have happened. A simple conversation could have solved everything months earlier. A little respect could have solved it. One email could have solved it. Instead, here we were. I drove slowly through the subdivision and stopped along the curb in front of Rick and Apos' house. Now here and Apos' the important part. I never stepped onto his property. Not once. I stayed entirely within the public frontage area. The exact same type of space he and Apos' been using in front of my house. The exact same type of space he and Apos' insisted wasn't and Apos' a big deal. Then I started unloading. One bag, then another, then another. Branches stacked neatly, mulch piled carefully, everything organized, everything clean, everything exactly where it belonged. By the time I finished, the curb in front of Rick and Apos' house looked remarkably similar to mine had looked for months. I stood there for a moment, admiring the symmetry. Then I climbed back into my truck and drove home. No speeches, no notes, no dramatic confrontation, just silence. The next morning my phone rang at 7:03 a.m. I know the exact time because it woke me up. The caller ID displayed Rick and Apos' name. I let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, another call came. Then another. Then another. By the fourth call, I knew exactly how the conversation would go. So I ignored that one too. Finally, a voicemail notification appeared. I played it on speaker while Emily poured coffee. The message started with a long pause. Then came Rick and Apos' voice. Tight. Controlled. The kind of voice people use when they and Apos, retrying very hard not to scream. And quote, Mason, I Don and Apos. Know what kind of stunt you and Apos. Retrying to pull, but you need to remove that mess immediately. Call me back, end quote. The message ended. Emily looked at me. I looked at her. Then we both burst out laughing. Not because Rick was angry, because for the first time, he was experiencing exactly what he and Apos been forcing on someone else. But here and Apos, the thing. I never called him back. A year earlier, maybe I would have. A few months earlier, definitely. But by then I understood something important. The conversation wasn't Apos, the solution. The documentation was. So instead of calling Rick, I opened my laptop. Then I assembled everything. For months of photographs, video clips, dates, emails, certified mail receipts, copies of HOA regulations, every interaction, every violation, every ignored warning. I organized everything into a single report. Then I submitted a formal complaint directly to the association board. Not to Rick. Not through Rick. Around Rick. For the first time, the issue landed on the desks of people who couldn't and Apos simply dismiss it. 3 days later, I received confirmation that an investigation had been opened. 5 days later, several board members contacted me requesting additional documentation. A week after that, things started getting interesting. Apparently, some members of the board had no idea what was happening. Others had heard rumors. A few homeowners even submitted their own complaints about unrelated issues involving Rick. Small things. Selective rule enforcement. Favoritism. Questionable spending decisions. Nothing explosive on its own. But together, the picture wasn't Apos great. What started as a complaint about yard waste suddenly became a spotlight. And once that spotlight turned on, people started noticing things they hadn't and Apos noticed before. Or maybe things they and Apos ignored. Then came the board meeting. The room was packed. Far more people than usual. Word had spread. Emily came with me. Carl sat 2 rows behind us looking like a man attending the season finale of his favorite television show. The investigation findings were presented. The violations were reviewed. The documentation was displayed. One photograph after another. One date after another. One ignored warning after another. At one point I glanced across the room. Rick wasn't Apos looking at me. He was staring at the floor. For the first time since I and Apos known him, he looked small. Not because someone had humiliated him. Because facts are difficult to argue with. Especially when they and Apos read your own rules. The board issued multiple violation notices. Fines followed. Additional reviews were scheduled. Then came the moment nobody expected. About halfway through the meeting, Rick stood up, cleared his throat, and announced his resignation as HOA president. Just like that. 6 years. Gone in less than a minute. The room went completely silent. Nobody clapped. Nobody celebrated. People just sat there absorbing it. Because whether they liked him or not, Rick had been a fixture in the neighborhood for a long time. Watching him walk away felt strange. Even for me. The weirdest part is that I didn't and Apos feel victorious. At least not the way I thought I would. I felt relieved. There and Apos a difference. Victory is beating someone. Relief is finally putting down a burden you and Apos carried too long. A few weeks later, the neighborhood felt different. Quieter. Lighter somehow. The curb in front of my house stayed clear. Deliveries arrived without problems. The landscaping crews suddenly discovered dozens of other perfectly acceptable places to stage debris. Funny how that works. One evening, several months later, I saw Rick while walking the dog. For a second I wondered if he and Apos say something. Maybe argue. Maybe apologize. Maybe blame me. Instead, he simply nodded. I nodded back. And we kept walking. That was it. No grand finale. No dramatic redemption. No last-minute confrontation. Just 2 people moving on. But every now and then, I still think about the whole thing. And I keep coming back to the same question. Was I right to send everything back? Some people say yes. They think I simply gave Rick a taste of his own medicine. Others think I crossed a line, that I should have kept taking the high road. Honestly, I can see both sides. What I do know is this. The dumping stopped. The rules were enforced. And for the first time in months, everyone was treated by the same standards. Whether that counts as justice or petty revenge probably depends on who and Opos is telling the story. So now I want to hear from you. If someone repeatedly ignored your requests, violated their own rules, and used their position to push you around, what would you have done? Would you have sent the yard waste back? Would you have gone straight to the board? Or do you think I should have handled it differently? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I have a feeling this one is going to divide people right down the middle. And if you and Opos VE ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA, a difficult neighbor, or someone who thought the rules only applied to everyone else, make sure you share your story too. Trust me, I want to hear it.